They could be, yes.
We're just about ready to begin. Welcome to Spoken History. Thank you for all coming out tonight at the library. And thank you to our friends who are online viewing this through our YouTube channel. Spoken History is a collaborative effort of the Northwood County Historical Society, the Marshfield Historic Preservation Association, City of Marshfield Historic Preservation Committee, the Marshfield Genealogy Group, and the Everett Rail Marshfield Public Library. My name is Natalie, and I'll be introducing our speaker tonight. Tonight's program is a brief history of the Marshfield Clinic, the first 50 years. And our speaker tonight is Mr. Brian Finnegan from the Marshfield Clinic Archive. He has been at the clinic since June of 2003, and starting as a reference librarian and then taking over as the manager of the clinic archive. Brian plays saxophone in the local band called Hub City Jazz here, so maybe you know him from there, and also plays in the Marshfield Civic Band. We are fortunate to have him speak with us tonight, so please welcome Brian.
Thanks, Natalie. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all here tonight. As Natalie mentioned, I came to Marshfield in 2003 for a job as reference librarian with Marshfield Clinic. And the clinic library, the medical library, manages the clinic archive. 2015, I became manager for the medical library and therefore responsible for the clinic history. And I've had a great experience over the last 20 years learning all about the history of the clinic. But I do have a few people I have to thank for that. And one of which is, some of you may know the name Stan Custer. Dr. Custer was the clinic's first historian. And my understanding, or what I've heard, is whenever he heard of someone retiring or a department closing down, he would quick hurry over there and see what kind of items he can grab from the garbage can to make sure it wasn't lost. So thank you to Stan for doing that. And Dr. Russ Lewis. Many of you know Dr. Lewis. I can't imagine how many thousands of babies he delivered during his tenure with Marshfield Clinic, but he wrote the unofficial history for Marshfield Clinic. And he had a whole history talk series in the early 2000s. And that's where I learned all about the history of Marshfield Clinic. And a tip of the hat to Alana Zaya and Lyle Horder as well for their work with the History Archive and keeping all this going until the present day. So without the work of all those people, I wouldn't have had any knowledge. I wouldn't have had any photos. I wouldn't have had anything to really share with you tonight. So let me move on to what we want to talk about with thank you for all those people. So when did this all begin? This all started about 1915. So thinking about the early 20th century, what was a doctor's office like? What was medical practice like back then? And excuse me. Early 20th century, a doctor would pretty much be practicing out of their office. They would have a sign out their front door. This was the era of the doctor that would go do a home visit, right? They would take their horse and buggy, go out to the farm, treat the patient, deal with the illness, set the broken bone, whatever it might be. So there wasn't a lot of time necessarily in the office. But in 1915, there was about 10 physicians that were practicing in Marshfield. And in April of that year, Dr. Carl Dagey wrote a letter to all the other 9 and said, thinking about having this idea, do you want to have a meeting and talk about something that he called a structured practice arrangement? So I'll tell you more about that in just a moment here. So there was about 5 or 6 of them got together in that summer of 1916, and they had their first incorporation meeting in December 23rd of 1916. So you can see between April and December, there was a few months there where they were arranging things, kind of getting things lined up, and they had to fill out paperwork with the state medical board. So that's what why it was delayed until December, and they saw their first patients in January of 19. So let me take a few minutes and tell you about each of the founders of Marshfield Clinic and where they were at that time. So Carl W. Davies, he was probably the instigator behind all of this. He was born in Stettin, Germany, 1867. He emigrated to the U.S. and settled in Cleveland as a teenager. He received his medical degree from Western Reserve Medical School right there in Cleveland. So the question in my mind is always, how did someone like that get to Marshfield, right? How did he get up here? Well, while he was in medical school, his family went ahead and bought a farm over in the Thorpe, Wisconsin area. So Carl graduates medical school. He gets on a train on his way to Thorpe. And I have the story written down here. I just wanted to read it real quick because I want to make sure I got all the facts right. I wasn't there way back then. So on the train ride there, they are being on the way to Thorpe. After graduating medical school, the conductor suggested getting off at Marshfield and taking a look at that town as a young physician. The conductor said, Marshfield is a young, thriving town that's rebuilding from a fire 3 years previous. And it was a railroad hub. The patients could get on from surrounding towns, could get on the train in the morning, go see their doctor, and then take the afternoon train home. So Dr. Davies followed his advice. He liked the city. He also found out a hospital was going to be built here, and that was being built by the Catholic nuns. And then Carl Davies decided to stay. He thought that looked like a nice spot. So that was the year 1890. He had great success right away. 1 year later, he returned to Cleveland, married Frida, and brought her back to Marshfield to start their family. So, Carl Davies was general surgery. He was a well-known surgeon in the area. More about him in just a little bit. William Hipke, he was the oldest of the clinic founders. He was from Wisconsin, so he was born in New Holstein, went to medical school at the University of Illinois, graduating in 1891. And then he went to Vienna, Germany for a couple of years to pick up some more training. After that time, he settled in Marshfield. So about 1910, he set up his own office. I would say we know the least about Dr. Hipke from, as far as the clinic founders. We have the least of information about him. He was, like I mentioned, the oldest one of the group. He was elected the clinic's first treasurer and remained in that position for his entire career here. He was very involved in other businesses in Marshfield and was on the board of several of the banks in town as well. So he was very much business minded as well. Also read that during World War I, he conducted many of the Army's physicals. So that's a little bit about Dr. Hipke. He was eye, ears, nose, throat, EENT. Back in those days, they were all combined there. So that's William Hipke. I want to just change the order there. Let me tell you about H Milby, and then I'll come back and tell you about that in just a second. So H Milby, he was born in Canada, 1870 in Ontario. Went to the Toronto Medical School, as they later changed the name, graduated in 1896. How did he get to Marshfield from Canada? Right? Again, another story. How did he get over here? Well, he, after medical school, he went to the town of Roberts, Wisconsin, which is way over by Hudson, so way over on the west side of the state, and had a drugstore and office there. That town was totally destroyed by a tornado in 1899. He was newly married, now didn't have a drugstore, didn't have any work. What do you do? He had heard about Marshfield from a colleague from medical school, so he and his new wife, they relocated to Marshfield and set up their medical practice there in 1901. And he quickly found a friend and colleague in Carl W. Davies. So the two of them worked together quite a bit right away. Now, what I want to tell you is how Milby and Mason are connected. So again, let me just read this so I get these facts correct for you. When the Milbys came to town, they bought a house on South Maple, which was next to Walter Mason, who at that time was the town photographer. That is right near the kitchen table, if those of you from town know where that is. He quickly became friendly with Mason's son, Victor, who was then a high school senior and had an interest in medicine, but his dad was a photographer. So Milby quickly became a mentor to young Victor Mason. Milby was also a very popular physician in town. He had the first x-ray machine, and in 1925, he got the clinic's first EKG machine. So that's just a little bit about H Milby there. Now let me go back to Mason here and kind of put those pictures together there. So Victor was born over in Michigan, but the family moved to Marshfield as a young boy. I think he was about 8 years old. And when he was 18, Milby moves in next door and becomes a big influence upon him. Victor actually goes to graduate school at University of Toronto as well because of Milby's influence. The quick little fact on that is, right after graduation, he married a Marshfield school teacher, and they went off to England for a couple of years so he could do some further studies, some further education on surgery techniques that were over in Europe. And they returned in 1908 to start his practice. He was the most progressive of the founders. He was the most forward-thinking. He started the lab at the clinic, and he actually hired Anna Andrews in 1918 to run the clinic. So he hired a woman to run the clinic operation, which would have been quite a big deal at the time. Mason did all the education and all the training for the staff and any students that they might have had. It's written that all respected his ability. He was generally considered even a better surgeon than Davies. He was frequently called to towns in northern Wisconsin for surgeries. He would hop on the train, and he often took one or two nurses that he worked with him up to those towns. So there's a little bit about Victor Mason for you. Okay, Roy Potter. So he's another Marshfield, or another Wisconsin boy, I should say. He was born in Boston, 1879. He went to Milwaukee Medical College, graduating in 1903. And it says here he established a medical practice in Auburndale the same year, 1903, as a rural doctor. Now, here's the story. I'll let you decide if this is true or not. But after medical school, he got on the train starting up for Marshfield, but ran out of money in Auburndale. So that's where he got off the train and started his medical practice. Whether that's true or not, I'll let you guys decide for yourself. But he was the classic rural doctor, horse and buggy doctor, right? He's the one riding out to the farms, to the outlying areas to tend broken bones, deal with injuries, things like that. Now, the cool story about him is Davies knew that Roy Potter, had a cousin who was a professor of radiology at Northwestern, and that this new field of radiology had great potential for the clinic as well as for the future of medicine. So Davies convinces Potter to go spend some time with his cousin and return and take over that part of the clinic practice, and that worked out very well. Potter also was the physician for the Wood County Farm for many years. He was loved by all in the community as well as the clinic. He was considered an excellent physician and often asked for a second opinion on tough cases. So that's a little bit about Roy Potter there. And I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast. I'll settle down once we get more into it a little bit. Walter Sexton. So here's the final one of the clinic founders. He was born in Madison. And both of his parents unfortunately died early on in Walter's life. So he came up to Marshfield to live with extended family, and that was the pharmacist W.A. Sexton at that time. So he went to grad school or to medical school at Johns Hopkins over in Baltimore, and he returned after that, and he set up his own practice, and he really became associated with K.W. Davies. So they worked hand in hand quite a bit. That's prior to the founding of the clinic. After that, though, about a year or so in Marshfield, 1915, he returned to Baltimore, married Ethel, and brought her back up here to Marshfield. So you see a common theme a couple of times that's happened. They've gone back and gotten their gal and married her and brought her back to town. So Sexton was the youngest member of the clinic founders. He and Mason were both most interested in the scientific matters and did most of the teaching for the clinic at that time. And Dr. Sexton's specialty was urology. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what was going on here in the country. So the idea of a group practice, people in central Wisconsin would have never heard of that. I mean, there were other group practices, like think about the Mayo brothers, even the Gunderson brothers down in La Crosse, Geisinger over in Pennsylvania. I mean, there was other group practices, but people here in this rural area would have never known or heard about that. So the founders, probably K.W. Davies, wrote articles in the local paper to kind of explain what they were going to do. And the one on the left, I think this is fascinating. This is 1916, and I quote, "They explain that owing to the fact that the practice of medicine has become so highly specialized in every branch, it is virtually impossible for any one man to be perfect in each of its numerous departments." So I'll pause there a minute. Think about that. 1916, they're already talking about the fact that medicine is so highly specialized. Well, think about what's happened since then. I mean, how could any one person know everything in medicine? The other article here on the right, quote, "The real aim of the organization is to give better and more efficient service to the public and do it in a more scientific way in order to be able to compete with the large medical centers." And they go on to say, "Each member of the firm, besides his usual work, will do reading and study in a special field. He will thus gain more expert knowledge by reason of such study and will, through this extra knowledge, assist and help his colleagues in diagnosing especially difficult cases." So right from the beginning, when they're explaining what this Marshfield Clinic idea is going to be, they're talking about becoming specialists. They're talking about working together. They're talking about collaborating and encountering the most difficult cases. So that's how they kind of set themselves up right from the beginning. I just shared that to you thinking, I just think that's fascinating. Over 100 years ago, they were already concerned that medicine was so highly specialized that they had to dedicate time and effort to deal with that. Okay, so I told you about some of the founders and a little bit about what their philosophy was. Where was their first location? So their first spot was on the corner of Central and 3rd. I think right now there's a mortgage company on the first floor. So the clinic founders had the second floor, and you can see our floor plan over on the right there. If you notice the largest room, what's the biggest room there? Right in the middle, that's the library. So the biggest square footage they dedicated to the library right from day one. Again, they wanted to become specialists. They wanted to get further education on all the different topics of the day. They had to have books and journals and magazines to be able to study and do their reading. So, and in fact, the medical library up at the clinic still has some of the early magazine and journal subscriptions from the day. I know they still have Dr. Davies' American Medical Science going back to 1887. So anyways, sidetrack. Sorry about that. I'll come back to the topic here. Any questions so far? How's everybody doing? Yes, please.
You said Mason and the other one were the most progressive. You think because of their age or so young, they had a new outlook?
Yeah, so the question was noticing that a couple of the founders were more progressive than the others. It probably was a little bit to do with the age for sure. But perhaps they were just a little bit more forward thinking, about the future. It's hard to tell, but I think the age certainly had something to do with it for sure.
Second thing.
Yes.
How did Mason's dad, the photographer, wind up here?
So the other question is, how did Victor Mason's father end up in Marshfield? That I don't know. We don't have much history on his parents. So if anybody knows that, let us know. We can put that into the history. So they've gotten started. Let me jump into a couple of years later into the 20s here. Carl H. Davies, so that's the son of K.W. Davies, born 1892, goes to Johns Hopkins Medical School, graduating in 1917. He joins the Army. It's the ending of World War I, and he goes over to Vienna to study their advanced techniques for a year or so. Comes back by 1920, he is able to join the Marshfield Clinic. He retired from medical practice in 1970. So think about 1920 to 1970, a 50-year span, what the medical changes he would have seen. I mean, that would have been quite impressive to his medical career and what took place, generally speaking, in medicine during that time. And he passed away at the age of 77. It noted that in 1949, he was also president of the Wisconsin Medical Society. So again, well-respected name. But the next families to kind of join the clinic were the Vetter family. So up on the screen here, I have JB, James B. Vetter, and Harry A. Harry A. was a couple of years older. He was born in 1879 in Marshfield. His younger brother James was born in 1883 in Marshfield, but notice they graduated medical school from Northwestern, which is in Chicago, at the same year. And the reason is Harry had childhood illnesses held him back for a couple of years, but they were able to go to medical school together. Harry specialized in general surgery. He had 3 daughters, and James specialized in obstetrics pediatrics. He had 3 sons, 2 of which became doctors and joined the clinic as well. And those are Charles. So Charles was born in Marshfield in 1910. Went to Northwestern, seemed to be the family tradition, graduating in 1936. He was surgery and urology. He served 4 years during World War II. I noted that in 1957, he was elected president of the clinic, and he retired after a nice, long, successful career in 1972. His brother, 2 years younger, James S., a veteran, born also in Marshfield, went to Northwestern Medical School, graduating in 1937. He joined the clinic in 41, and then shortly after that, World War II, he joined the U.S. Navy. He was a decorated war hero. He wrote a very successful book about his time as a surgeon in Iwo Jima. So he shared that experience that he had. Again, a successful career with Marshfield Clinic, retiring in 1973. So that's a little bit about the Vetter family. So we got the Dagey family and, you know, the people involved there, and then we got the Vetter family as well. So some of the other people that joined around this time. So Lyman Copps is from Stevens Point. We know his brother's food chain, Copps Grocery Store. So Lyman went to Rush Medical School in Chicago, graduating in 1915, specializing in EENT. He joins the clinic in 1919, so about 3 years after it got started. He was elected the clinic secretary in 1929. He is widely regarded for holding the clinic together during World War II. So World War II, with all the rationing, food rationing, I've heard stories that people couldn't pay, so they paid in chickens or they paid in vegetables or whatever it might be. Yeah, maybe that happened. That certainly could have been. He passed away in 1951 at the age of 62. His protege, and I'll tie those two together in a second, was George McCormick. Dr. McCormick was born in Greenwood in 1901. He went to Marquette Medical School, Milwaukee, graduating in 1927, joined a year later. Under the tutelage of Dr. Copps. He was elected secretary of the clinic in 1940. 1951, he leaves Marshfield to start a private practice of ophthalmology in Waukesha, the same year that his mentor passed away, so 1951. So clearly that relationship was very close and a special bond between those two. So some of the growth here. 1920s and late 20s and early 30s. Jack Millard joined in 29 as an OBGYN in pediatrics. Paul Dagey, so that's the brother to KH, the son from KW, was a general surgeon. He joined in 1930. Frank Beckman joined in 1931, general practice doctor. Robert or Bob Baldwin joined 1934, internal medicine doc. And then Victor Mason's son, Robert, joined as an orthopedic surgeon in 1936. And they all were here for quite a long time, so they all had successful careers with the clinic. So a little bit of growth there through the 1930s. But I want to take a couple minutes to tell you about Stephan Epstein, who joined the clinic in the mid-30s. So quite a story here. So Stephan was born in 1900, Nuremberg, Germany. He studied at universities in Erlangen and Munich, where he met his wife, Elsbeth. So he was Jewish, and he spoke German was his only language to speak. And I've got a little bit of the story here because I want to make sure I get it right, because it is really a fascinating story. If you're thinking about, you know, the rise of Nazi Germany kind of during that time and the persecution of the Jewish population, this is a person severely affected by that. So he realized he had to get out. He had to leave Germany for the safety of him and his future family. So his mentor in Germany wrote a letter of recommendation to a Dr. Marion Sulzberger in New York, who agreed to help Epstein if he could find his way to America. Dr. Lyman Copps, who we couple slides earlier, was visiting a friend in Chicago who happened to be a close friend of this Dr. Sulzberger and knew of Dr. Epstein's situation. Again, they were able to put people together. That's how he found out about Marshfield Clinic as a possible landing place. In the dead of winter, 1935, Dr. Epstein bought a $5 bus fare from New York to Marshfield. The clinic offered him $200 a month to start. He liked the group practice idea and took the job. Starting in early 1936, Doctors Potter and McCormick worked diligently with Epstein to teach him English. About a year later, it was time to bring his wife and his kids up to Marshfield as well. So really great story about people helping him get not only to the U.S., but to the middle of the U.S., all the way out here to Marshfield on a $5 bus fare. I think that's pretty amazing. Anyhow, Dr. Epstein is certainly considered the father of the Research Institute and tried for many years to get something going and get something organized. By 1959, they were finally able to establish the Marshfield Medical Research Foundation. And that was a great thing for all of us. At the age of 65, Dr. Epstein left Marshfield to go to Madison, and he passed away at the young age of 73. So a really cool story, I think, for the clinic there. All right, so we have all this growth, all these new doctors. We had to expand beyond that second story building. So they built their first location. We call it the 1926 building because that's the year it was built. If any of you know downtown, the 7-story old town hall building, this is the little building to the left or south of that. I believe there's pickleball courts in there now. So anyhow, you can kind of see how what it would look like in the front desk there. Notice the archway of the front door. We'll see that in a later picture. So during the 40s, a lot of growth is going on here. 1941, Jacob Wickham joins as a radiologist. Ed McGinn joins in urology. 1945, there's Stan Custer, gastroenterologist, joining the clinic. George Miller in ophthalmology in 46. John Miali, pathology in 46, as well as Russ Lewis as OBGYN joined that year. And Frank Gozzi, cardiology, joined in 1948. And most all of those had lengthy careers here. Not everybody, but lengthy careers here with the clinic. Here's the group picture. If you like to see pictures, there's a young Russ Lewis on the top right, a young Stan Custer on the top left, and others scattered throughout. So in 1947, they were able to get everybody into one area. It quickly gets beyond that. So the 50s and 60s, a lot of the growth during this time is in the laboratory and the research development, like I mentioned. 1953, Fritz Wenzel is hired as the director of laboratory, so person dedicated to that area. 64, Dwayne Tewksbury comes on as our first research scientist, PhD level. So the importance of that is our first staff person dedicated purely to scientific research. This person's not going to care for patients. They're not going to do other things. So that's a big, important moment there. Next year, then Fritz becomes the executive director of the Medical Foundation, which oversees research and education at that time. 66, the second research scientist is hired, Ron Roberts, quickly joined by Ed Plaka, and so on and so forth. I just put all those three because there they are in that picture down on the bottom right. And like pipes, there was Dwayne with his pipe. I'll just pause here. Anybody got any questions going along? Yes, sir.
All these group doctors did they hear just word of mouth? I mean, how would they hear about Marshall? Why did he show up in Marshall?
Yeah, so good question. So the question is, how did these new doctors that are joining the clinic hearing about Marshfield Clinic, right? How are they hearing about this place? It certainly is word of mouth, right? I mean, that's how Stephan Epstein got here, because he knew a guy knew, that kind of a thing. They went to medical school with somebody. That guy graduates, gets set up in Marshfield because maybe he was the one that grew up here. Well, his buddy's looking for a job now, and he calls him up and says, hey, there's room up here in Marshfield. So it's definitely word of mouth. probably the medical schools could have been loosely involved. They might have had a list of places, but I think it's mostly word of mouth. This was certainly well before the era of, internet research and things like that. Probably weren't headhunters back then either, but yeah, I think word of mouth was an important aspect to the growth of Marshfield Clinic. Speaking of which, here's a whole bunch of the people that joined. I only put those that stayed more than 5 years up here for you, but maybe some of these names will you know them or know of them. Norm Helland in urology, 1950. Dick Rowe, dermatology, 50 to 84. John Burns, anesthesia, 51 to 80. Tom Rice, OBGYN, 51 to 86. John Suits in pediatrics, 52 to 85. George Magnan, internal medicine, 52 to 92. Art Mocht in psychiatry, 53 to 70. James Heersma in pediatrics, 53 to 70. Ben Lawton, thoracic surgery, 54 to 87. Joe Owsley, oncology, practice 55 to 94 here. William Haywood, psychiatry, 55 to 86. W.B. Larkin, otolaryngology, 56 to 64. James Muneer, gastroenterology, 57 to 71. Gail Williams in general surgery, 57 to 88. Lee Schlosser in hematology, 57 to 2000. So it's a 43-year career. James Muneer, gastroenterology, 57 to 71. George Greasy in pediatrics, 57 to 88. Dean Emanuel in cardiology, joined in 58 to 86. John Ruppel, OBGYN, 58 to 87. Bahij Salibi, neurosurgery, 58 to 85. Don Peterson, anesthesia, 59 to 88. Robert Bodmer, radiology, 59 to 66. And Frank Lorenz, practice endocrinology, 59 to 76. So I just think that's neat to see all of those lengthy careers. You know, you think about a career now, someone lasts than 30, 40 years is going to be unusual. And that seemed to be a lot of these people stayed that long. And there's some big names in here. Those of you that know Marshfield Clinic recognize a lot of the big names here that joined during that time. All those physicians joining the clinic needed space to work, right? So 1957, the first edition. So there on the top left, there's the little building that they built in 1926. So it lasted a good 30 or 40 years before they had to do the 4-story addition to the north side. So on the top right, you can kind of see the shell taking place. And the top right picture, I left it like that because does anybody remember the Normington Laundromat? That's the building that's just off to the right there, Normington Laundromat there. And you can see the bottom left picture, besides my head moving in the way there. What they're starting to do is the old building, you can see the archway of the door is still there, but they're kind of smoothing the surface. And then the bottom right, that arched front entrance is gone. They've covered it over to match the whole facade. Now the entrance to the clinic is on the building to the right. It's on the 4-story building. So as an archivist looking at pictures, how do I know the year? Those are clues we look at to help us know what year we're looking at. I look for little clues like that. Like, is the front door still there or is it not? And that type of thing. So that's the 1957 edition. Here is that 1957 physician group. It's starting to get a little bit big here, right? It's starting to expand. There's some fun photos in there. Top row in the middle, just to the right, there's a young Ben Lawton. For those that can pick his hair out, he had great hair. Dean Emanuel is about 3 to his left in the top row, young people. George Greasy, front and center with his bow tie. George Magnan just to his left. And yeah, good group. So that's the 59, physician group. I've been talking about physicians and the doctors because that's an easy number. I can tell you there were 20 physicians, there were 40 physicians, but really the running of the clinic was all the people behind the scenes or the people at the front desk, kind of all the other people besides the physician. So Here are some of the fun pictures that we found. The records room personnel, the cashiers, registration personnel, insurance and welfare department. I'm sure that's called something different now. It's probably called SHP. Medical department staff. It looks like a nursing group there, and stenographic department. A few of the people there. And perhaps some of you can recognize some names maybe that you know or perhaps worked with. So there's some people of the x-ray department, some of the secretaries. There's Jane Gray in the physical therapy area, some nurses, some more stenographers. In the bottom right picture, I think that's like a laboratory because I can see a microscope right in front of there. Anybody recognize any of the names on these pictures?
Where did you locate it?
Good. So the question is, where did I find these pictures and some of these old pictures? So this is all part of the clinic archive.
Yeah.
So the clinic archive has a lot of the old pictures in storage that we can utilize.
Library?
In the library at the clinic, not here in the public library. Yeah. So that's just fun to look at some of the old pictures there.
That center bottom one, that's one of the only pictures of Gwen Siebold.
Yeah, so the comment is that in the bottom picture here, the stenographers, Gwen Siebold is right in the middle. She's the one young lady that's seated down. And there's an award, a research award. It's a research award named after her. Yeah. So talking about research, there's my nice segue into that. So, you know, I mentioned Dr. Stephan Epstein was the father of research. In September 15th of 1959, it was finally official. And I quote, "The first meeting of incorporators and directors of Marshfield Clinic Foundation for Medical Research and Education is held." And Dr. Epstein was elected president, Dr. Schlosser the vice president, Fritz Wenzel secretary, and Floyd Dietert was the treasurer. Floyd Dietert was the clinic's business accounting type person, so that certainly made sense. So, but notice the name; it says research and education. So those two groups were together at that point in time. And they had a couple buildings. The early building was cleverly called the Brown House, the one on the left, because it was a brown house. And the first research building off to the right, we call it the old research building. Maybe they called it the new research building. That's still in existence. That is on St. Joseph's Ave, across from the hospital, just south of the Ronald McDonald House, if you're from town and know where that is. So that's still owned by the clinic ORB, old research building, but it was a new research building at some point in time back in the late 60s into the 70s and so on. So let me tell you the important thing with the research and why 1959 and why that was important. So the clinic got its first NIH grant. It was awarded in 1960, but the meeting happened the year before. So Mel Laird, Marshfield native and very fond of the clinic and very supportive of medical research in general, helped organize a meeting of a group of researchers from Marshfield to go to Bethesda, Maryland to talk to the people at NIH. And the people that went along were Stephan Epstein, Dean Emanuel, Lee Schlosser, Gail Williams, and Fritz Wenzel. They all went to NIH to talk about the project that Dr. Emanuel was working on called farmer's lung. It was a respiratory illness that ended the career of many farmers at a young age, and they didn't know why. So it happened to deal with the silage and the fungus and mold growing in silage, and they came up with better ways to store hay. But anyways, the trip was successful. They were able to fill out the proper paperwork, and they were awarded the grant in 1960. And the records I have show it was for $41,500 over a 3-year period. If you think about NIH grants today, that would be like $41 million, but you get the idea. It was, the important point is that once you get the first NIH grant, you can get the second and the third, and the ball just kept rolling. And that is really when things started going for research at Marshfield Clinic. And today we're still involved in NIH grants, like the All of Us project, which many of you have heard about, and others similar to that. Incidentally, I didn't put it on the slide, but the second grant was awarded to Dr. Epstein for a photodermatology type research project. Okay, any questions about any of that? I could see you were itching for a question. Yes, sir.
What was the second grant for?
I didn't write down the second grant. Stephan Epstein got it. He was a dermatologist, and it was a photodermatology type project. Yeah, I can't explain it very well. I can look it up for you afterwards, though. No, it was photodermatology, if I remember right. But don't quote me on that. And you people at home, don't quote me on that either. So here's a couple pictures from the early research buildings. The equipment, as you notice, the equipment is very large. A lot of it's much smaller and more digital today. So I'm starting to come to the 1966 edition here. So this is what the town hall building that we see today on Central Avenue, the 7 stories. So the first edition was just a few years earlier in the early 60s. Here it is like 4 years later. They're building 3 more floors. So things are really happening and really expanding at the Marshfield Clinic. So that is kind of how we recognize the building in town today. And here is that 1966 physician group. Now it's getting so big I can't put the names on the slide for you. There's the names, but let me pause it here and see if anybody has any questions for me. Yes.
When does the first female doctor show up?
So the question is, when does the first female physician show up? Yeah, so it was Dr. Fisher Williams. Yep, came. I'm going to say about the early 60s, probably 64. I had some help from the audience, so thank you for that.
So is she in there?
She is not. She stayed for only a few years. I don't see her in this picture. She might have just been absent from the day the picture was taken. I don't have any information about that.
This might have been to a picture of directors. There was actually a 3-year initiation period before you were elected to the board of directors as owners at that time.
So for those of you at home, back in this time frame of the 60s, 50s, and so forth, a physician that joined Marshfield Clinic for the first 3 years was not a voting member, quote unquote. And then after the 3rd year, you could become a director voting level. And we're speculating maybe this photo is just the voting members of the clinic directors type of thing. But sorry, we don't have that fact exactly straightened out there. So I'm going to leave it back on that picture, but I will open up for any questions if anybody thought of any other questions about the beginnings of the Marshfield Clinic. I purposely stopped here with this building because then if I'm invited back, and you guys can have a say if you want me back or not, would be to start when the clinic moved up the hill next to the hospital in the early 1970s and kind of bring it into the 2000s perhaps. So we'll see if Natalie wants to do that or not.
Is there a reason why the research foundation was so far away from the clinic at the time?
So the question is, why was the research foundation so far from the clinic? I think a lot of it had to do with animal research. So they were housing animals in that brown building, for example, to do animal, experiments, not in a bad way, but just they were training on how to give IV injections in rabbits, for example. They had dogs that they did heart surgeries on, practiced heart surgery techniques on, things like that. So you wouldn't want the animals in the same building as you were treating human patients. So I'm speculating a little bit, but I think that would be a good answer to that question.
I do know too, there was an animal facility up near the hospital building. So it would have been kind of kitty corner across. And
Yeah.
so that was
Yeah, and another answer provided was that there was an animal facility that was closer to the hospital. So if the researchers had to be moving between sites, maybe it was just easier for them to be located off site from the clinic. That's a good question, though.
It's located where the school of nursing
Yeah,
or was.
Yeah, it was located where the south building was, just off of St. Joe's Ave. Yeah. Yes,
We have
Natalie.
A question from Homer, not a question, a comment.
Yeah.
From Michael Schuman. Yes, we want you back. Please do part 2. And I second that too.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, he'll be back. Okay.
All right. All right. Anybody think of any other questions for me about the beginnings of Marshfield Clinic, the first 50 years or so? I think it must have been a very exciting time to be here to see that growth. I mean, it goes, you see this picture where, and then at the beginning was this. And in this little town, why would they choose here? You think about, why did Marshfield grow as it is? Why did the hospital and the clinic choose? It was because of the railroad connections. I mean, you and I, that makes sense now, why we call it Hub City, right? Because the railroads were meeting here. It gave a chance for patients to hop on a train, get to Marshfield. Also, a lot of the lumber area up north, if there was an accident, they could put the injured person on a train, scoot them down to Marshfield, and then there would be doctors in the hospital here as well. Yes, sir.
Up to this point, there were not even any loose associations with other practices within the state. It was solely Marshfield Clinic providers, self-contained.
So the question is about, did we have relationships with other institutions, like other hospitals and clinics?
I know that we had clinics.
Oh, locations, yeah.
Right.
So at this point, as far as other Marshfield Clinic locations, you're correct. It was just in Marshfield. The first one was in Mosinee about 1973-ish. So that'll be for the next talk, about the growth of the outreach clinics and all the different locations. Yeah. And the hospital was, and I'll get to that at the next talk too, I think, the relationship with the hospital, because that was a separate entity, right? That was started by the Catholic nuns, and then which ran it for many years. So the hospital was up on the hill, the clinic was downtown. They were physically separated even in town. But the doctors would send their patients up to the hospital and say, okay, I'll check on you later on. I'll come and see how you're doing. Because the hospital wasn't staffed by doctors, it was the nuns caring for the patients, and nurses. So it was a little bit different time than what we think of it as today.
And then when you started your talk, you said that there were 10 Marshfield Clinic providers in the city itself, 6 of them incorporated.
Mhm.
The other 4 just stayed as private practice till they dissolved.
Correct. Well, they were self-employed doctors. So the question is, at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned in 1915 there was 10 physicians, and they were typically by themselves. And I know one of them was definitely getting ready to retire, and maybe 2, I don't know. And the other two, Atlanta can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe were the Vetter brothers. They didn't want to quite join yet. They wanted to see what this was all about. And then 3 or 4 years later, as you saw, they decided to join on. So that would account for all 10. 6 joined, 2 joined later, and the other 2 were of an age to retire.
And then from that point on, there were no more independent providers in Marshfield. Everyone's been a clinic.
Oh, I can't I can't say that. So the question is about independent providers. Are you, at that time, you're either Marshfield Clinic or you're not here in town? I don't know if I would say that. There probably could have been individually practicing doctors doing their own thing. Maybe they wanted to compete against the Marshfield Clinic doctors. I can't.
I know that's true because Dr. Baldwin's wife was a physician. And when I was a young girl, I saw her.
So someone from the crowd shared that there was other doctors that were in town that were not Marshfield Clinic doctors. One was Dr. Baldwin's wife, who was practicing on her own, and that person in the crowd actually remember seeing her. So yeah, I would think there would have been other doctors still in Marshfield or the local area that were not part of the Marshfield Clinic group. They could do that today. They certainly can do that. All right. Anybody think of anything else? Okay. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Natalie's going to come up with some closing comments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was really interesting. Seeing something start at the beginning like that, and then look how the clinic affects all of us here. I know we all know somebody who works there, or it's just a big, huge part of Marshfield. It's all intertwined. So that was really interesting to see that. And I learned something. I've been using the word orb kind of like I know what it means, and I had no idea that it stood for Old Research Building. Did you guys? You all knew that? Yeah. I guess I thought it was more of, I don't know, a satellite thing. I don't know. But anyway, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Brian. It was wonderful. And we will have him back. If he wants to do that, we will have him back, and we would love to hear more about it. The next Spoken History, I'm going to tag that since you're all here tonight, is going to be July 13th. And our speaker will be college student Tim Krause. And he's going to be talking about the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin regiments at the first day of Gettysburg. So it's right around the 4th of July here. So we're gonna get something military. So anyway, so thank you for coming out. Thank you to you, those of you online. And if you missed it tonight, you know somebody who missed it tonight, please tell them that they can still see it on our YouTube channel at a later time. So it'll be on there. So thank you. Everybody have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.